after taking a few weeks of pause from our series on miracles in Mark, we are back at it for this Sunday and next Sunday before we conclude. For those of you who have not been part of this series, have not heard this, we started by noting that the Greek language has no word for miracle. That is a modern English word. But in the Greek original text, there are 4 words that scholars sometimes choose to translate miracle. The 4 words are works, signs, wonders, and powers. And those 4 words may help us to understand what is truly happening as we encounter these stories of miracle. We also have been noting that our job when we encounter these miracle stories is not to ask the question, how did this happen? But rather to ask the question, why? Why did this happen? Today's story takes place around what is commonly called the Sea of Galilee, although our translation more appropriately calls it the lake. It was often called the Sea of Galilee. It was a lake that is about 13 miles long and 8 miles wide. So sizable, to be sure, and oval in shape. The west side of the Lake of Galilee, Sea of Galilee, was the location of much of Jesus' early ministry. It is there, along those shores, that Jesus calls his first disciples, where people seeking healing come to Jesus from every direction, and where he teaches multitudes of individuals who come longing to hear this message he brings of God's new hope. Now, to be sure, the traditional location for teaching up to that time would have been the synagogue. But the seaside provides an alternative setting for Jesus as Jesus does his teaching with those who come to him. Now it's worth pausing for just a moment to think about what the ocean or the sea or some lake means in your life. For those of us who live on the coast, the sea is often a place where we go to walk and to reflect, to contemplate, to view the vastness of God's creation, to be right-sized again, to remember ourselves as one of the many of God's created beings. It is a place where we take in beauty. It is a place where we learn from our experience and perhaps make some choices to turn towards new directions and new choices in our lives. So this context is certainly true for Jesus and his disciples as well. The lake is poetically a place of spiritual insight, of learning, of reflecting, and of encountering God. After the last story we had talked about, which was the story of the feeding of the many, Jesus tells his disciples to cross the lake and go to Bethsaida, a new location, literally, and symbolically. He's asking his disciples to move into a new territory. And the east side of the lake is outside of this sort of homeland from which the disciples and Jesus had started their ministry. So they set out for this journey and crossed the lake overnight. We are told that it is the fourth watch when these events happen, the fourth watch encompassing the last hours of the night, a time when the sun is not yet visible, but its rays have just begun to illuminate the land and the air around it. The disciples see Jesus, and their first thought is that he is a ghost, because of course humans can't walk on water. But there he is walking, and they are terrified. But then he speaks to them, and they recognize him. And they're given this opportunity to understand the nature of Jesus and the power that comes through him. To understand that Jesus has capacity to quiet the storms and to surmount the powers of nature by walking on the water. Now, these are all things that everyone at that time would have assumed were God's powers. And so we're catching a glimpse for the first time, perhaps, of God's claim to be co-divine with God. Now, the point of this story is really not so much to force us to believe, but rather to invite us to join with the disciples in this moment of wonderment, of surprise, of terror, of mystery, and of hopefulness about Jesus and who he is and this ministry to which he calls them. There is a kind of poetic beauty in this moment in which he calls them out of their journey to recognize that they are with him in this new ministry, this new territory to which they are going. And is it not so? Jesus calls us all to ministry into the unknown, which is exactly where we are now. In a time where many of our staff will be changing, where we need to contemplate the direction of our ministry, where demographics around us are changing the way ministry happens and churches have their impact in the community. Just like for Jesus, where the traditional place of teaching was the synagogue and Jesus took it instead to the shores, we may need to move from the traditional place of the church out into the world. We're moving into the unknown territory of the east side of Galilee, sent with a commission. But just as we're on our way and perhaps disoriented and terrified and battered by the waves, Jesus himself comes to keep us company, to reassure us and still the storms that batter us, and to take us along with him into the new and unknown and unfolding place of ministry. The question for us as we face this miracle is not how this happened, but why. Why? Because Jesus' disciples need Jesus' company as we venture into the ministry to which he calls us. Amen.